I'll tell you a little bit about who I am. I was in federal law enforcement for 24 years, retired in uh, 2006. And I had a friend who I went to church with who was a former missionary. And she had to come home because she was disabled. So I would go over to her house and do little chores for her. And back in, I believe it was 2012, 2013, I was over at her house in the fall and she asked me if I could go pick some apples for her. I said, sure. So I went and grabbed a bucket and I grabbed a ladder and I headed out to the orchard. And I came back in 10 minutes. I said, I'm sorry, I can't pick any apples. All the apples were just way too high. The trees apparently had been pruned. If they ever had been pruned, they hadn't been pruned in probably 34 years. So I said, I know how to prune an apple tree. My dad had taught me how to prune an apple tree. I usually had one or two apple trees wherever I lived. And I said, I'll be back. And when it's dormant, the trees are dormant, and probably February is the time we usually cut our do our pruning. Well, that winter, I was just kind of thinking, I knew, first of all, I knew that her grandfather was the first owner of the property, or at least in her family, and she thought it was maybe back in 1915. And so I was thinking one day that winter, I called her up. Said, do you know, I knew they weren't going to be apples that I was familiar with. And I said, do you know what kind of apples are in your orchard? And she said, well, I know the very top row. Those are yellow transparent. If you don't know what yellow transparent is, it's the earliest apple that becomes ripe in late July, around here. In late July, they ripen. And they're also very cold-hardy. The apple originally came to the United States from Russia in the early 1800s. And but she didn't know any of the other apples, so she called her brother. He said, well, the next row of apples he knew were Wealthies. And I knew what a Wealthy was because I'd started looking at old apple varieties by that time. And Wealthy was the first bred apple in the United States. It was bred by a fellow up in Minnesota who couldn't get many trees to survive the harsh Minnesota weather. And he started to breed some apples, and he came up with Wealthy. Wealthy is a wonderful apple even today, and is able to resist very harsh cold temperatures. So I did something. It was kind of crazy. I got on the internet, and boy, did that ever take me down rabbit holes. But as I started reading more and more, the first thing I came up with was Arcadia. The biggest orchard in the world was just in Deer Park. I was just blown away, and that just kind of sucked me in, and I became interested that way. This is, I mentioned my friend's orchard. This is her orchard. It's about 300 yards away from her house, and she thought this picture was taken maybe about 1955. And as I got more and more interested about old apples, I started buying some books. One of the books I bought was Old Southern Apples by Lee Calhoun. I was fortunate even to speak with Lee a few times. He passed in 2020, but Lee was a good friend, and he also was a great help to me. His book, the first half of the book, is about old Southern apples that are still available today. And the second half of the book is about old Southern apples that are believed to be lost or extinct. And that was the first time I ever heard of anything, that there were extinct or lost apples. But and then I started reading more about people that were searching for lost apples, and I found that there was a number of people looking for them. John Bunker up in Maine, Carlos Manning in West Virginia, Tom Burford in Virginia, Lee Calhoun in North Carolina, and Tom Brown in North Carolina. Tom Burford has passed away. Carlos Manning is no longer active, but Tom Brown and John Bunker are still looking for lost varieties. I did not know why all the I'll call them apple hunters, were along the East Coast. I just figured, well, that must be the only place that you can look for lost apples. I just kind of took it for granted. Well, as I became more and more interested, I was researching. I came across a fellow by the name of George Rudy. And George Rudy was as much of a researcher as he was a nurseryman. And he was down in Colfax, and there were articles about him. He would send universities new varieties of plums and new varieties of apples. There's an apple that was introduced by George Rudy. It's called the Palouse apple. And back in the early 1900s, railroad carloads of Palouse apples would be sent out of a train station in Whitman County and sent back east. It's not a lost variety. It's still around today. You don't see it very much, but it's a wonderful apple. But anyway, I went to this particular issue of the Colfax Gazette because there was an article about George Rudy in it. And as I was reading, I noticed that there was an article about the Whitman County Fair. I thought, whoa, I wonder how apples, are presented. Is it the best pie or presentation of apples, best plate of apples? But as soon as I saw this, I knew it was something important. And what I realized was every apple variety got a prize. So every single apple that was entered in the fair, variety of apple or cultivar of apple that was entered in the fair, got a prize. So I'm thinking, okay, so if this newspaper prints the results of the county fair and the apple presentations, if I looked at maybe a 10-year period of time, I'd probably know what apples were being grown in Whitman County. As I looked at this list, I started to write down names of apples that I hadn't seen before. And included were Walbridge. That turned out to be a lost apple. Langford, a lost apple. Babbitt, a lost apple. Fred Huffman. He was one of the first people that I started to look at, because I thought, Fred Huffman was growing 2 lost apples on his property. I'd kind of like to see if maybe that property still had apples on it. And so I did some looking around Colfax. I forget who put me in touch, but they put me in touch with a fellow. His last name was Huffman. He'd had a heart transplant 2 years before I met him, and he passed away 2 years after I met him. But he said, "Yeah, I'll take you out and show you the old homestead." And so we hopped in my pickup and we went out. We went to Steptoe and then went west from Steptoe about 2 miles. And all of a sudden he said, "Stop." And we stopped right there on the road, and he pointed up on top of a hill about 3/4 of a mile away. And he said, there were pine trees. I could see pine trees on top of wheat fields. And he said, "That's the Huffman homestead." And that is the Huffman homestead. And it still stands. There's probably an acre, maybe an acre and a half. It still has apples. It still has plums. It still has pears. And unfortunately, it still has evergreen trees. And the pine trees pretty much shade out all the fruit trees. So the fruit that you get from those trees you're lucky if you get an apple the size of your thumbnail. We have not finished with that house, but we have not found any lost apples yet there. But the house is it's had better days. Probably raccoons and every other critter live in the house. Half of the roof has collapsed, but that is the homestead. And I mentioned that the Walbridge was one of the apples that I looked for, because Fred had entered the Walbridge in the county fair. And so I thought, I had just met some folks. What I see. Okay. Okay, there we go. Now I think I know where I am. Okay. So I thought, the Walbridge is a unique apple. First of all, it was entered more times in the county fair between 1900 and 1910 than any of the other lost apples that were in the fair. 6 different people entered the Walbridge in the county fair. And plus, the Walbridge had a unique look to it. It was a red apple, and it had dark maroon streaks on it. And the other name for Walbridge was Edgar Redstreak. So I thought, I made some contacts in the apple world. I met with some folks down with the Home Orchard Society down in Portland, and I knew they had apple identification experts who worked for the just what is what did I just say uh, well, down in Portland. I knew there were people down in Portland who could identify apples, so I contacted them, and I said, "Can I send in some bags? There's some red apples here that kind of look like the Walbridge." They said, "Send them on." They said, "Okay, how many apples to put in each bag, and how to label the bags, and all that. So, and how to mail them to us." So I did all those things, and just as I was about ready to send those apples off to Portland, I was in Colfax. I was driving along. There was a water pump station. And as I was driving by it, I noticed there was an apple tree that was bending over the water pump land there. And it was a bizarre looking apple. And I thought, I'm going to pull over here. And I pulled over and I grabbed a few of the apples. I thought, this is the weirdest apple I've ever seen. I said it had corners on it. I have no idea why those. Okay, there it is. There it is, fall genitive. And so a couple of weeks later, I got a call from the experts, and they said, well, all those apples you thought might be the Walbridge are not the Walbridge. But that other apple that you sent us, funny orange apple, they said that's a fall genitive. And of course, I responded, what's a fall genitive? And luckily, that is a watercolor painting of a fall genitive. And that brings me to why there are watercolor paintings of apples. Back starting in the 1880s, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, or whatever it was called back then, contracted with about 20 watercolor artists to paint fruits and nuts. And there's about, I believe, 3,500 watercolor paintings of apples that anybody can download off the internet. If you go to USDA pomological watercolors or just watercolors, somehow you'll get to an area where you can get to these paintings and download them. They're super high quality downloads, and the artists are amazing. And some of the artists are incredibly good. Some of them are not quite so good. For real popular apples of the time, like Rome Beauty or Wine Sap, you might find as many as 10 individual paintings of those apples. Fall genitive, one painting. Thank goodness there was one painting of that apple. That was our first lost apple recovery. It was shortly after that I started to realize that this was becoming a bigger project than I had anticipated. I went to the Whitman County Historical Society, and I asked to become a project under the Historical Society, and they accepted Lost Apple Project as a project under their Historical Society, which meant I didn't have to do a lot of paperwork, which I'm so glad not to do. And but we do have to raise our own. Okay, so I mentioned that the fall genitive I found over a water pump station. That water pump station was basically right behind here. That is Colfax College. Colfax College, one of the founders was a fellow by the name of Theophilus Smith. And that apple tree was right about back there. The college is now burned down, but Theophilus was one of the fellows who started the college, and I think it was a Lutheran college, and one of the first teachers was a fellow by the name of F.N. English. He was teacher and president of Colfax College. Why I bring up the name of those fellows is F.N. English submitted apples to the Whitman County Fair. And, of course, Theophilus Smith, he was the first nurseryman in Colfax. So I think there's probably pretty good a chance that one of those fellows planted that tree. And what we do whenever we find a lost apple, we always graft it onto trees, our own trees that we can control. Also, we send grafting wood down to Temperate Orchard Conservancy down in near Portland, and they immediately graft 2 trees. And the conservancy basically is a place where these apples will never become extinct again. And if you've never seen an apple graft, this is what it looks like right there. It's kind of the V. We call that a whip and tongue. You cut the wood and it kind of fits together like that. Then what we do is we take rubber bands. You can use rubber bands. You can even use electrical tape. But a lot of people use a stretchable kind of polyurethane. But we use rubber bands, tie it all the way around the graft, and then after we've grafted it, then we put a kind of a black goop on. There's remnants of a black goop. The reason we put that goop on there is to keep the graft from drying out. We want it to be nice and moist in there, and it's all done when the trees are dormant too, so they don't have leaves on them. It's all done during dormancy. Okay, we're going to go for a little lesson on the birds and the bees here. Of course, Washington, especially Eastern Washington, is known for wheat crops. And being a wheat farmer, it's pretty easy what you put in the ground, because what you put in the ground is a wheat seed, and you expect to get a plant that is wheat. Well, apples are not that way. Apples are closer to people in the way that we reproduce. For example, if you have a Honeycrisp seed and you put that Honeycrisp seed in the ground, you are not going to get a Honeycrisp tree. If you happen to go on eBay and if you happen to type in Honeycrisp seeds, you'll probably have 5 or 6 opportunities to order Honeycrisp apple seeds. And if you do that, you're kind of a fool. And that's what the people are counting on, because when you have 10 Honeycrisp seeds, you're not going to plant seeds that will turn into Honeycrisp. What you get is basically half of the DNA of the mother tree. Let's say if you have in your backyard, you've got a Golden Delicious, and over the neighbor right next to you has a Honeycrisp. Okay, so your Gold Delicious is going to bloom. It's going to have all these blossoms come out, and the bee will go up to Honeycrisp and get pollen and come over and then start hopping onto your blossoms. So it's going to be off of those blossoms there, it's going to be half DNA from the Gold Delicious, half from the Honeycrisp. You think, well, that's not a bad, duo. That's probably going to create a really good apple. But it's not that way. It's kind of weird when those seeds and they grow up to produce apples. 97 to 99% are going to be apples that don't taste good. Most of them are going to be what we call spitters, which is you take a bite out of that apple and you would just want to spit it out as quickly as possible. With Cosmic Crisp and some other apples that have just recently been introduced, they start out with maybe, I'm not sure, tens of thousands of apples. What they do, I believe Cosmic Crisp was Enterprise and Honeycrisp, I believe, were the parents. And so they, in a very controlled environment, they would get, and I'm not sure if they started out with Honeycrisp trees to be the mother, or whether it was the Enterprise that was the mother. But anyway, they started pollinating, so they knew exactly what was pollinated with, and then from that they would take the seeds out of every apple, and every seed in every apple is 100% different from any other tree in the world. So it's not like these blossom, any of those trees are the same. It's, they're just all going to be different. And, but anyway, so Cosmic Christmas, they're making Cosmic Christmas. Maybe they started out with 30,000 trees. Those have to get big enough where they produce apples. And as soon as they taste the apple, that's when it tastes terrible. Yank that tree out of the ground. Move on to the next one. That tastes terrible. Yank it out of the ground. But pretty soon they got it down to, I don't know what a working number would be. Let's say it was 50 apples that tasted good. Well, then they had to figure out, how does this, is a good keeper? Is an October apple, which would be a good keeper? Or is this an apple that, has a lot of issues with diseases? But eventually they came up with Honeycrisp was out of all those apples, was a Honeycrisp. Anyway, that's how the plant breeding is done today. For apples, at least. Okay, why do we have lost apples in the Pacific Northwest? Well, it all starts actually over in Europe. And when the first pilgrims landed here, there were no apples here in North America other than crab apples. And so any apples that you see, whether they're, maybe along a side road or next to railroad tracks or anything, every single apple had to have come from overseas. And the reason that people wanted to bring apple seeds to North America was that they were basically extending their custom. And in Europe in the 1500s, 1600s, the plague was going around. And about every 20 to 30 years, the plague would pop up and people would just be devastated. They didn't know that. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't understand the disease at that time. We know, of course, now that that alcohol is one of the things that can kill bacteria. But the thing that the Europeans knew, that especially people in London, you couldn't drink any water from any of the rivers flowing through London because that's where the sewage went. And if somebody died of the plague, they threw them in the river, and they're betting they threw that in the river. And so basically, the fresh water was just not there especially for the large towns. And what people turned to was hard cider. And hard cider was incredibly popular. It was so popular. Everybody had cider trees. If you didn't have cider trees, you bought cider because that's the only thing you could drink and be assured that you wouldn't get sick. So everybody drank hard cider. Even little kids drank a watered down version of hard cider. And there was just millions of apple trees grown in Europe so people could drink and not get sick. Well, of course, in the United States, they come over. We have sparkling streams, rivers, and creeks and things like that. But they brought their custom with them. And so everybody that hit the ground in North America, they brought apple seeds and threw down apple seeds, and millions of apple seeds were thrown down and grew cider, grown for cider. Once in a while, I mentioned that once, 97, 99% of the trees aren't going to be that good, but once in a while, when you throw down that many seeds, you're going to get a couple that are going to taste good. And when let's say a farmer had a tree and it produced a really good tasting apple, well, the first thing he's going to do is he's going to go to his neighbor and say, "Hey, taste this apple. See, what do you think of it?" And they would go, "Yeah, that's a pretty good apple. And I'd like to have some grafting wood of that next spring if you don't mind." He said, "Okay, sure. Well, what do we call it? Because it has to have a name." And let's say the fellow that brought it to you his name was Doc Brown. Well, let's call it the Doc Brown. Okay. Maybe it popped up next to a chimney. Well, let's call it the chimney apple. You didn't know how some, like Arkansas, there's a lot of Arkansas apples. Arkansas Beauty, Black Arkansas. So you knew those were apples that were named from where they came from. But the Pilgrims arrived there and they started planting cider orchards. everybody knows the story about Johnny Appleseed, and he actually was a real person. And he would go to cider mills and he'd get seeds that, of course, the seeds were not needed for the cider. It was just the juice. He'd get the seeds and go plant orchards. He'd later either give away his trees, or he would sell his trees. But he was a real person. He lived in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And of course, right around 1800 is when the United States was really taking shape. We had made the Louisiana Purchase. We had negotiated the Spanish territory. And finally, we also negotiated the Northwest. And so now we knew what we had. We had the United States property, and Lewis and Clark went out on their expedition 1804 to 1806. And let's see, show you another slide. And the Oregon Trails started in not too long later, 1840. And that allowed everybody who wanted to come out to the Northwest via the Oregon Trail. Now, one of the first fellows that came out, he actually came out before the Oregon Trail, was Marcus Whitman. And if you're familiar with Washington State history, Marcus Whitman started he was a preacher, he was a pastor, a missionary. He started a mission down near Walla Walla, and another fellow came out with him, a fellow by the name of Spalding, and Spalding ended up going to the Lewiston area, and he started a mission down there. Lapway actually is the exact location of his mission. But Marcus Whitman was there in 1836, and this is how everybody came out to the Northwest, in these wagons. And in 1847, Henderson Llewellyn was just about ready to make history, because the Oregon Trail opened up in 1840. Well, in 1847, Henderson Llewellyn came out. I believe he had 3 of those wagons, but one of them was dedicated to nursery stock. And it was filled with nursery stock, and then he had a mixture of a little bit of soil, charcoal, and some other things. And basically every night that he was on the Oregon Trail, he would water his plants. And but he arrived at the Whitman mission in 1847, and Marcus tried to convince him to stay in that location, but he said, no, I'm headed farther. I'm headed to basically the Portland area. It was a wise choice, because it was just a couple months later that Whitman was killed along with his family and some other missionaries. And that location, basically Eastern Washington, Idaho, Eastern Oregon, was all shut down by the Army. And it wasn't until Fort Walla Walla was built in 1856 as a response, and the Army basically went around and to solve the Indian problem. And by 1858, they announced that it was now safe for these homesteaders to go into eastern Washington, northern Idaho, and homestead. Well, Ransom Clark, he was one of the first to arrive, and he wanted to begin a nursery, and he actually came out. He began his nursery in 1859. He was in the process of building his cabin in 1859. He had his 13-year-old son with him, and his wife Lettice was back in Portland, and she had one small child back in Portland, and she was also pregnant with their third child. So Ransom, he starts the first nursery in Walla Walla, gets the log cabin started, and then he hired a fellow to finish the cabin, and he left his 13-year-old son there to work with this man. And Ransom went back to Portland to get Lettice and bring her back to the Walla Walla area. Well, unfortunately, it's believed that Ransom probably picked up pneumonia on the way back to Portland, and he died shortly after reaching Portland. Well, Letitia's family said, well, certainly you're not going to do something so foolhardy to, go out to Walla Walla where, there's no town, there's nothing out there other than, your son and a cabin. But Letitia said, you know what? Ransom said that this was a wonderful place and I'm going to go see. So she got on a steamer, still pregnant, got on a steamer, went up the Columbia River, got off, got on a wagon or a coach, went into Walla Walla and found her son, informed her son for the first time that his dad was dead. The cabin was complete, and she took a look at the area. Ransom had already laid out trees for the nursery, and she decided, you know what, I'm going to build this. I'm going to do it. And so she went back on some carriage, went back to the Columbia River, took a boat back down to Portland, had the baby, then comes back with two babies and her 13-year-old, and again starts the nursery. And she is absolutely revered in Walla Walla. There are wines that have been named after her. There's a play that has been done in Walla Walla about her life. She is a true pioneer. Now there is the Ransom Clark cabinet. I believe one half is for cooking and the other was for sleeping. I think because of fire hazard maybe. So that is the cabin, and this is a picture of me.
Yeah.
I have been transported back in time. This is actually at the Fort Walla Walla Museum. They've kept that cabin, and they maintain it there. It's great. What that is. Okay, so as all these homesteaders are coming out west, there would be publications to kind of guide the homesteaders on what to expect and what they needed to do. This one happens to be for Nebraska. It was a little pamphlet called Forests and Orchards in Nebraska, and it told homesteaders what to do. In this case, there was a section on what kind of apples to plant, how many to plant. They had two experts. This was one of them, John Young. And both experts agreed on one thing, and that was you should plant 100 apple trees for a family supply. And then he goes through the wine sap, 25, white winter pearmain, 5, Jonathan, 5. But the most important apple was the Ben Davis. And the reason Ben Davis was so important was because you could put a Ben Davis apple in your cellar in October, late October, early November, and you could go down to your cellar in April or May. You could still have a fresh apple.
Wow.
And you can't say that about any other fruit, maybe a few vegetables like carrots or something like that. But that's the only fruit that you could have fresh in April or May of the next year. Okay, this is a typical homestead. This obviously is a very wealthy family. Beautiful barn, handsome house. This was actually, those cliffs are right above the Palouse River down in Whitman County. And anyway, so the reason apples are so important is that they have so many uses. First of all, you can eat them fresh from July to May. Okay, so the first apple is the yellow transparent. You could eat that at the end of July, and still you could eat Ben Davis in May. You can fry them. You can stew them. You can bake them. You can can them. Dried apples were super important. Everybody dried apples. And of course, during the winter, that's one way to keep them as food. You can sauce them. You can make hard cider. Here's a really important one, apple cider vinegar to preserve other foods. This is another one, apple butter. Apple butter is actually, what they would do is take a huge pot and put a bunch of apples in it, get right up to the top with apples, then pour water in, and then light the fire, start that water boiling. Just keep it boiling and boiling and boiling, and eventually what you get down to once that most of the moisture is gone is you've got a glaze of sugar at the very bottom. And for people that were, well, before the trains came out in 1880, railroads arrived in eastern Washington in 1883. Before that, sugar prices were just going to be phenomenal. You'd either have to bring them over the Oregon Trail, or somebody on a boat could go around South America and bring them up to San Francisco and bring them, that's just, it was going to be incredibly expensive. And then disease fruit, you could even feed to your animals. And there wasn't that, and there weren't the diseases that, they didn't have codling moth back then. Most of the codling moth and other insect disease weren't a problem until after 1913, I think it was 14. They believe the codling moth and some of the other insects came in to cause problems. Philip Ritz was the second nurseryman in Walla Walla. Super important. His name might sound a little familiar. After he started the second nursery in Walla Walla, it became the biggest nursery too. He went up to the Ritzville area. He encouraged the railroads to build a railroad through what is now Ritzville, and he was able to get them convinced to do that, and he promptly named the town after himself. This is a reprint. This was published in 1893 on the 30th anniversary of his nursery opening in 1863, and that's so it has all the apples that he sold when he first opened up. Here are some of the apples. And what nurseries did at that time is they sold them in according to the season. Summer apples, and you can see at the very top, yellow transparent. That was because that's the first apple to become ripe. And then all the way down to the winter apples.
Sweet June.
And then WSU had another catalog from the Ritz nursery, also known as the Columbia Valley Nursery. And this one's from 1879, I think that is. There it is. And this is an advertisement Mr. Ritz put in the Colfax Gazette in their first issue of the Colfax Gazette, which was, I believe, in 1878. And he said he had 1 million trees. I don't doubt him, but he didn't sell just apple trees or just fruit trees. He sold, maple trees, every kind of tree. Also, he sold a lot of small fruits like strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, things like that. Just to give you an idea. Okay, so 1870, Walla Walla is the only place that you would live, and everybody wanted to live around Walla Walla when they first came out. So the Army says in 1858, you can come out. Well, everybody wanted to be close to that fort because, there were rumors all the time about marauding Indian bands. And so the Walla was just totally circled by all these homesteaders. And then all the good land, and Walla Walla is a great place. They've got rivers, they've got creeks, a lot of water and deep soil. But as people come out in the 1880s, 1890s, suddenly people are pushed out to areas where maybe there's the land is not quite so good, and there's the water is not quite so available. But in 1880, you see Walla Walla still growing a little bit. 1890, boy, that Spokane has suddenly jumped. And the reason for that is the railroad arriving in 1883. And of course, Spokane immediately became the hub of the area with mining and logging going on. And the nurseries in Spokane are not nearly as interesting as the nurseries in the outlying parts like Windham County. And that's because there was a lot of money going into Spokane. So their nursery catalogs had a lot of, beautiful lilac bushes and beautiful flowers and maple trees and things like that. So, okay, now I get back to Colfax. Theophilus Smith, I mentioned he started at Colfax College and he was the first nurseryman. Here's an ad that he ran. And Theophilus if you go into Colfax and you take this road up here, there's where Theophilus Smith and his nursery were. And there is a flyer that he would give to people with all of his apple varieties. Just so happens that, and this got from Washington State University, the Wall Bridge, we've already heard that name before. This was 1872. This says Islam Sweet. That's actually a misspelling. It should be Isham Sweet, and that is a lost apple. I mentioned George Rudy before. George, I've never been able to find a catalog for. This is the only ad I've ever found that listed apples that he sold. But I mentioned George was a researcher. In his biography in a history book, he's mentioned that he worked with Washington State University, and in 1892, Hungarian apples were imported into the United States by whatever the USDA was at that time, and they believe contacted or contracted with different universities around the country. And the fellow who ran the WSU, he got the Hungarian varieties, and this is all in the history books, and he worked with George Rudy with these varieties too. And George's ad doesn't have any of the Hungarian apples, but you can tell he was interested in apples that other people weren't selling, because I mentioned Wealthy before. That was popular. Some of these other are very popular. The Pearmains, the Northern Spy, the Baldwin, the Blue Pearmain. Those are all popular apples. But nobody, I can assure you, was selling St. Petersburg. That sounds kind of like a Russian variety. Mm-hmm. And Peter the Great, again, maybe Russian variety. Mm-hmm. So he was. And here's a picture of George. If you guys happen to spot him, let me know. Got a lot of questions. And there's an ad again. George and Theophilus Smith, they kind of got into I think they got into a spat, and everybody would try to outdo the other in how pretty their ads were. Okay, this is the Hanford Castle in Oakdale. How many here have heard of the Hanford Castle? Okay, I'm going to educate you then. So Edwin Hanford came out from Chicago. He had his pockets were just bursting, and he had a lot of money. And so he came to Oakdale, and he saw Oakdale. This was about 1888. And he said, you know what? This place is going to be the next Spokane. And he was wrong. But he built his house anyway, up on a hill above Oakdale. Is it 8,000 square feet? Something like that. You can play basketball in the attic. That's very cool. The people that own it, they invited me in, took me on a tour. It's totally cool. Every room, every bedroom had a little fireplace where you put coals in at night, keep you warm. And I have a little coal bucket there. And the people have renovated the building and brought in things like little coal buckets and things like that. That really is a lot of work to do. And they went to, and a lot of people also have donated things that the Hanfords had, and I think there was probably a garage sale back in the early 1900s, and some people got some things, but there's also a servant's staircase that goes right in the middle of the house. It's very cool. But Hanford had a lot of money. He planted an orchard, and he also started a nursery. And I did a talk in Oakdale, and there's actually quite a few of Hanford's relatives that still live in the Oakdale area. And this is a flyer from about 1902. And all these red apple names are considered lost varieties. And then if you come down here, it says the above list is the choice of 145 different kinds of apples fruited. Okay, so that tells me 145 different kinds. Then this one kind of would get by if you didn't know, but John apple resembles Duchess of Oldenburg, but it ripens months later and keeps all winter. the relative of Hanford said that actually the John apple was introduced by Edwin Hanford. Some farmer came into him, had either purposely planted an apple seed or accidentally maybe one popped up, but he brought an apple in from an apple tree on his property and said, "What do you think of this apple?" And Edwin Hanford said, "I think that's a great apple. Can I sell it?" And the guy they probably worked out a deal maybe for $5 or something like that Edwin could sell that. And he named it John after his youngest son. Okay, well, that was going to be important later on. So this is believed to be Edwin Hanford out in his seedling. So today, if you go to Home Depot, you go to Walmart or something like that, you want to get a fruit tree. Every fruit tree is either semi-dwarf or dwarf. You're not going to find a standard an apple tree on standard rootstock. And going back to how apples how apples grow, you know that seeds don't grow that apple. They have to be grafted. So every tree that is sold, every tree in your yard, your neighbor's yard, anybody's tree, if you have, for example, a Honeycrisp, that had to be grafted onto some rootstock. Okay, so one Honeycrisp tree, long 30 years ago, has resulted in every Honeycrisp tree in the world. All came from that grafting wood. Well, Edwin Hanford, there was no such thing as dwarfing rootstock back in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So Edwin Hanford, in a book that is called the Letters Book that I was given to use in my research by the Hanford family, Edwin claimed to be one of the few people in the West who grew his own rootstock. So what he would do, and the Letters Book was very interesting because it actually gave me the type of equipment that he used to plant his seedling orchard, and it was called the Planet Junior. Planet Junior, and actually Planet Junior is still in available today. They obviously have updated their equipment, but basically what it was, they had two handles and a wheel, and then a little bucket behind the wheel, and you could adjust the bucket to drop seeds. You could drop one seed every 6 inches. You could drop 4 seed every 1 foot. However that he did it, but he used the Planet Junior to do it, and that's Edwin out in his seedling orchard. And then every spring, once those trees are going to go dormant over the winter, so in the early spring he's going to go out, probably, if the ground has not been frozen or is unfrozen, he can start bringing those basically little naked trees inside and start grafting whatever he intends those trees to be. Okay, this is a nursery catalog from the Vinland Nursery Company, Clarkston, Washington. The reason this is important is because in 1906, Hanford sold his nursery to the Vinland Nursery Company. And there was a little article that came out in a little news journal for fruit growers, and it said that Vinland had purchased the Hanford nursery. They were going to keep the nursery in Oakdale. They were going to bring it down to Clarkston. Plus, they also started a nursery in Spokane Valley. I've never found any evidence they started it in the Spokane Valley, and I think they probably closed down the Oakdale nursery pretty soon after that. But it is a real nursery. Here's the catalog, what the catalog looked like. And well, I was interested in this catalog because I wanted to know what 145 apples were, because I only knew about 60 of them from that flyer. And so I started looking through this catalog, and I thought, I think I can figure this out. First of all, there are 140 apple varieties in the catalog. So it's pretty close, 145, 140. And then I look here, and sure enough, the John apple is being sold by by the Vinland nursery. So I'm pretty sure that basically Vinland just took whatever was in Oakdale and brought it down. And whatever was in that catalog was also growing in Oakdale. So I could pretty much figure that we could look for those apples if they were lost, like the Lankford, which is a lost apple. Then we could kind of use that as a guide to what we look for. And then I was doing I did a little presentation down in Pullman, and this was looks like in winter of 2018. I did a presentation, and I was explaining how I looked at the Huffman property, and I mentioned that I was going to look for some property near Troy, Idaho, also. And a fellow came up to me after my presentation and said, "Hey, I live in Troy. I'd love to go look for." And this fellow's name was EJ, and EJ is part of our committee today. But I said, okay, this is what you need to do. You need to go to the courthouse. You need to find out, this happens to be a receipt for William Smith of Troy, Idaho. All you had to do at that time, you didn't have an address. You just put in the post office, William Smith, Troy, Idaho. It got to him. Okay. William Smith ordered an early Colton, and he also ordered an enormous Pippin. And I can't read that. I think it may be 3 enormous Pippins. But anyway, and he also ordered Isham Sweet. And I said, go to the county courthouse, see if you can find an old plat map. You know, we're talking about, well, this was in 1904. So around 1904, if they've got a plat map, find William Smith's property, then find out who owns it now, and finally go out and see if there's apple trees on the property. Well, AJ did that, and sure enough, he found the property, and there's still apple trees growing on the property. None of them have been identified as any lost apples, but we're still working. Okay, this is right behind the Hanford house. Of course, the rolling hills of the Palouse, most of the time they roll, but sometimes they roll, and then on the backside they just kind of drop off. Well, on those type of hills, and this happens to be the hill the nursery Hanford house was built on, those really steep banks, they can't farm on. And so what they do is they plant a green belt. Pine trees, fruit trees, bushes, things like that. And there are still fruit trees in that green belt right behind the Hanford house. None of them have turned out to be lost varieties, but there's pear trees, there's apple trees, plum trees. Okay, so then I'd heard from several people about Steptoe Butte. They told me, have you seen the orchards on Steptoe Butte? There's some pretty big orchards on Steptoe Butte. So, well, that's great, because I'm going to be doing a presentation in Oakdale. They've got a small museum, and it was great. The day of the museum came, average age was probably about 80 years old. I thought, I'm going to come out of this knowing where those orchards came from. So did my presentation. After it was all over, I said, okay, who can tell me about those orchards on Steptoe Butte? Nobody raised their hand. Nobody raised their hand. I was shocked. But a lady came up to me later after. She said her name was Wanda. And Wanda lived about a mile west of Steptoe Butte, about that direction. And she said when she was a kid, Wanda was in her late 80s. She said when she was a kid, she used to go up to Steptoe Butte, and she and her brother would pick apples on Steptoe Butte. And she said, would you like me to show you where the apple trees are? And I said, you bet. So she took me to Steptoe Butte and showed me where the orchards are. But on the day that I arrived there, I went to if you've been to Steptoe Butte, you know, there's a picnic area right at the bottom of the butte. And I think it was in September, and there was picnic tables around there, and we still didn't know why or who planted those orchards. And I sat down at a park bench and looked around me at hundreds of thousands of apples on the ground in September, and I was absolutely speechless. I was stunned because. If you were growing for a family, you did not need that many early apples. That's just way too many early apples to have. And if you're growing commercially, you didn't plant any September apples for commercial use either, because let's say it's, you could have a 100-degree day in September and you're loading apples onto a railroad, and that railroad goes back to Chicago, and early apples are notorious for having kind of thin skin and not being hard, and if you bruise them they immediately turn brown. So just all sorts of reasons why all these hundreds of thousands of apples in the picnic area didn't make any sense at all to me. It still doesn't make any sense, but I'll tell you my theories. Okay, just in case you don't know where Steptoe Butte is, basically, if you go to, it's between Rosalia and Colfax, it's probably right about there. Okay. So this is an 1895 Whitman County plat map. And this was my first clue about who owned the butte. And first of all, thank goodness there was an 1895 plat map, because that's the oldest plat map they had. And the next plat map was 1910. Mm-hmm. And none of those people owned these properties then. But at that time, this says Steptoe Butte. So that's the top of Steptoe Butte right there. So a quarter of the butte was owned by R.E. Burns, and James S. Davis owned the other 3/4 of Steptoe Butte. Today, this is a satellite view of basically what the property looked like. So this would be, there's the summit right there. R.E. Burns' homestead was basically kind of like a boot shape. Okay, this is the picnic area right here. So you come in, there's Hume Road, there's a county road right here, and then you come in, there's the picnic area, and then you just start going up the butte. R.E. Burns' homestead was right here. Now, if you look at it today, they're not farming much on that homestead. And okay, and then on the south side, there's absolutely no pine trees. These are all pine trees. Now, on the north side, this is a ravine, a lot of area there that can't be planted because of too steep. And then there's also the biggest orchards after that are the West Orchard and the Southwest Orchards that I believe James S. Davis had planted. So I did another crazy thing, and that was I went on findagrave.com. And on findagrave.com, I found the family history for the Robert Burns family. And the lady that wrote the history, her name was Judith Kelly, and I was able to contact her, and she said, "Well, would you like the whole family history?" And I said, "Yeah." Apparently, the whole family history wasn't there, so I got family history in the mail. It was a little package about that deep. This is Robert Burns and his family in 1905. Robert and Macy married January 1st, 1889. Oh. By 1905, they had a ton of kids.
Wow.
I think they may have added a couple after that, too. But if you look at Robert, I don't think Robert weighed 140 pounds. And Macy, her maiden name was Hume. If you remember, I said, which Hume. Well, Macy's dad, where Macy grew up, was less than a mile from Steptoe Butte. I think her dad said, "Oh, well, you want to marry Robert, and he's going to be a wheat farmer." And by 1889, all the good land was gone. And what there was left was that plot on Steptoe Butte with a lot of land that you couldn't even farm. And I'm sure Mr. Hume came over and they had to, if you were here earlier, I ran a little bit of a film from Arcadia Orchards in Deer Park in the early 1900s. They probably had to, again, use dynamite, horses to pull out tree trunks, anything you can imagine to clear that land. And in that That satellite shot today, there's only about maybe I don't know, 33%, maybe a third of that land is even farmable. So it wasn't the greatest land, but Robert, he was a wheat farmer. Uh, but what Robert didn't know was that in 1893, a catastrophe was going to happen. And in 1893, there was a localized weather event. And it was that the rains came in early and never left. And all the wheat farmers, and it was basically the Garfield Steptoe area, uh, they couldn't get their wheat out of the fields, and they lost their entire crop. That's all Robert did. He was a wheat farmer, so losing his entire income for the year was really bad. But Robert, he made, I think it was a sound decision. He decided he was going to diversify, and he was going to plant fruit trees. And that was not a bad idea, but especially because according to Elberton had the largest prune dryer in the world, and Elberton was only about 5-7 miles away from here, so he had a ready place to any plums or prunes that he wanted to take over there. He had a ready market for those. Well, in 1894, after the weather catastrophe, Robert Burns started planting apple trees, pear trees, plum trees, cherry trees. Those trees are still there. Not all of them, because every year we lose a few more. But if you happen to go up to Steptoe Butte, and as you're driving into the picnic area, on your right are some park benches and things, and there's apple trees there, especially in early September. Those apples are going to be ripe there. And then as you head up, there's cherry trees on your right, there are pear trees on your left, and then out further from the road going up Steptoe Butte, there's still, you can see out there's green trees, and around those green trees those are pine trees, but most of the deciduous trees on the property are going to be some type of fruit trees. So, but Robert was fighting a couple of things. First of all, I mentioned earlier that everything that was growing at that time was not on dwarfing rootstock or semi-dwarfing rootstock, and the bonus of semi-dwarfing rootstock or dwarfing rootstock is, the bad thing is that they only have small root balls. They're not meant for dry land areas because they have to be irrigated. They also don't send out a root system that will anchor the trees to the ground. But if you put a seed in the ground, that's going to develop into a standard tree that could be 40 feet tall. It could have massive roots, and soak up every drop of moisture, and that's why they've been able to survive over 100 years. But the thing about standard is that they're not going to start producing apple trees until 6, 7. If you graft a northern spy, you can count on 10 years going by before you get your first apple. Mm-hmm. So standard rootstock, he was running against that. He was running into a lot of problems. And plus, I mentioned all those early apple trees. He was given wrong advice. I think he was given advice by the Hanford Nursery, because one of the things that said in there was the Hanford House is on the National Historic Register. And one of the family members mentioned that Edwin Hanford made a point to tell every customer that you should plant a wide variety of apples, because you could never count, maybe one variety would produce every other year, maybe would get frozen out. So plant a wide variety of apples to assure yourself apple health. That's not the type of advice to give to somebody who's going to grow commercial apples. He should have stayed with Winesaps, Ben Davis, let's see, Wagner was a popular out there back then. Rome Beauty. He should have stuck to those. He planted way too many early apples. And by 1899, unfortunately, he was forced to sell his property. In 1899, he sold his property for $1, and the fellow who purchased the property had to pick up $1,000 note. So Robert had gone into debt $1,000, and Robert then moved to, I think he moved to Alberta. Okay, yeah, that was the 1895 plat map. I mentioned that James Davis owns the rest of Steptoe Butte. Now, there's a road sign just near Steptoe, just before you get to Steptoe on the east side of the road. It says Cashup. Have any of you seen that sign?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that was pretty close to where James Cashup Davis had a stagecoach stop, and this is an artist's drawing of the stagecoach place. So what what Cashup did was he built a big hotel there. His family could stay in it too, obviously. But in his hotel, he also had a general store. He had you could buy food there. You could buy hardware, things like that. If you were in a stagecoach, the stagecoach driver could get his horses in here. They could get water. They could get fed overnight. And then they had a saloon. They had lots of liquor. They may have had some ladies of the evening. They had everything there. But in 1883, the trains came, and that was the end, because nobody took the stagecoach anymore. Yeah. Everybody took the trains. So Cashup, wanting to have something else to do, he always had a dream, and that was to build a hotel on top of Steptoe Butte. And that is 1888. And for anybody who's been to the top of Steptoe Butte, it's a pretty narrow road going up to the top. Well, if you can imagine the road that was built to the hotel in the 1800s was way narrower, and it was basically pickaxes, and I don't know if they used dynamite, but it was a very narrow road, and it zigzagged up the south of the butte. Didn't go around the butte. And on a snowy day, if you have there's a light snow on the ground, and if you look up at Steptoe Butte, you can still see the old road and kind of see a shadow of it going up. So in 1888, they completed the hotel, and it was a huge success for a couple months. And then nobody went up there. Well, everybody's going by trains. They're not stopping. Oh man, yeah, it was a huge flop. And so Cashup stayed in the hotel until he died. And but before he died, Cashup said a few things that were pretty funny. I mentioned that Theophilus Smith may have had a row with George Rudy. Well, here is an ad that was in the Colfax Gazette in October of 1890. So, the only collection of hardy trees that have been proven in the Palouse country, Cashup Davis, ever ready to show you wonders from Steptoe Butte, says, mine trees are the only one he has had that were worth a blank, blank, blank. The rest have become black-hearted. Well, that was unusual. You don't see many ads like that today. There's Cashup. He passed away in 1896. Now, Cashup came out west really late in life. Most people, when they came out and homesteaded, they came out when they were in their 20s, maybe 30s. Cashup was over 50 years old when he came out west. So I believe that all the apple trees on Cashup's property and the ravines coming off of Steptoe Butte, and there's a lot of apple trees, possibly as many as 300 apple trees still on his property, that his sons and grandchildren probably planted those trees on Steptoe Butte. Okay, I'm going to go kind of quickly now. A Nero was the second lost apple we found, and this was right as you enter the park. Just before you get to the picnic area, the Nero was on the left side. It is a good thing that we found it because that tree is now dead. Mm-hmm. It's a nice little apple. It's a nice little apple. It's not a big apple, but it's a nice little apple. Okay, there's the Finland Nursery Company. Well, I already talked about that. Oh, okay. So I was able to find a lot of information from Whitman County, Theophilus Smith's nursery, George Rooney's nursery. And then I was able to find it, Walla Walla. But I couldn't find anything for the Lewiston, Clarkston area. So I called a historian, a fellow by the name of Stephen Branting, who lives in Lewiston. He's a historian. He's written several books of history about the Lewiston area. And I said, I can't find anything about old nurseries in Lewiston. Do you know anything about that? And he said, give me a couple of weeks. A couple of weeks later, he got in touch with me, and he led me to this Lewiston Teller, is the name of the newspaper at that time, in 1907. And this is what he led me to on that page. It was an advertisement for the Oregon Nursery Company. And they had a general agent at the bottom, C.B. Chaffee. Okay, so what nurseries did in the late 1800s, early 1900s, of course, you don't have your highways, you don't have paved roads or anything. Everybody was either on horseback or maybe a small wagon. And nursery companies would employ fellows to go back on horseback or maybe take a little wagon. And they would carry a big book, and the book had beautiful watercolor paintings of apples and strawberries and all these wonderful fruits that you could order from them. And he'd go out into a farmer and he'd say, this is, what the nursery can provide you. And the husband and the wife, they'd look over and say, oh, I've always wanted to have the Rome Beauty apple and, maybe some strawberries and stuff. He'd take their order, and then this is in February. So then he'd come back in maybe April or May with their nursery stock. They'd give him the money and he'd leave. Now, there were not really very honest people that sometimes did that. And so you had to kind of be careful. But I think this is a legitimate nursery. And the Oregon Nursery Company just so happens I was able to find a catalog because the Oregon Nursery Company exists in Oregon. And so they sent their agents all the way to Lewiston. And in this catalog, there are some lost apples. So I know what the Oregon Nursery Company was providing to customers. He also, Stephen Branty also told me about another Lewiston Teller. This one came in November of 1902, and that happens to have an ad about the Lansing Nursery, also known as the Quaker Nursery, and that's an Oregon nursery. And sure enough, there is a catalog from the Lansing Nursery. And again, they were selling some lost apple cultivars. I mentioned Nero before. I'm just going to go kind of quickly through these. I didn't put all the lost apples that we've recovered here, but just give you a general idea. And again, thank goodness for watercolor paintings. Nero, there's the Dickinson. That was found on Robert Burns' property in 2016. Arkansas Beauty, that was found on Cashup Davis' property in 2016. Shackelford, that was found up in Chattaroy. McAfee, that was found on Robert Burns' property. Ewalt, that's a little bit north of Post Falls. Kinnigeski from southern Idaho. Blushing Spitzenberg from north of Post Falls. Autumn Gray from Waitsburg. Surprise from near Dayton. And that was a surprise. I was not expecting that. I bit into that apple. It was yellow on the outside, and Elva says, "Whoa, I did not expect that." And the cool thing about this is most almost all of the apples that we have recovered, we have evidence that they've been sold in this area from catalogs, mainly catalogs, university records, a lot of new Washington State University records. Surprise, I didn't have any record of that until about, I think it was maybe 3 years ago. I happened to go back through one of the Ritz catalogs, and I was looking through it, and of course it wasn't in the apples. And then after it went to apples, and it said something like oddities, and I looked under oddities, there was surprise in oddities. And that's not just in Dayton, less than 40 miles from Walla Walla. Surrey Synapse, that was found near Troy. Rick Mallard from Troy, near Troy. Jackson Lair Street near Waitsburg. Street Pittman was near Waitsburg. Mialafi, that was one of those Hungarian apples that Washington State and George Rudy were testing. We found a Mialafi about 5 miles south and east of Poland. Coleman, that's from near Troy.
How do you identify these? Just by phenotype?
That's how we used to. Well, I'll say prior to 3-4 years ago, the only way to identify these apples was to bag them up and send them off to apple identification experts. The apple identification experts I use basically kind of served an apprenticeship under an older fella, and he was, I think, out of Portland too. He would go to county fairs, state fairs, harvest festivals, anything like that. So every weekend of the fall, you could count on him being at one of these places. He'd take a little, a chair, a little table. He'd have, before the 7-volume books here, there was a stack of books that you'd want. There was one from 1855. The Apples of New York is a 2-volume book that anybody can, and by the way, you can download these off the internet because copyright's only good for 100 years, and then they're free. So Apples of New York, it's 2 editions, and they have wonderful, very descriptions. And he would take these books, and then people would come in. He was, he'd seen enough apples that if you brought to him a wine sap or a Rome Beauty, he'd just tell you right there on the spot. But then there'd be apples that he didn't know what they were. And he said, I have to take a look at those. So he'd pack them up, take them home, and hopefully he'd come up with that. Well, the people I use, journeymen under him, and they used to do the same thing. And and there's only 5 people in the United States that can do that. Yeah. And I think we have the best one. His name's Sean Shepard, and he's with the Temperate Orchard Conservancy. He's really good. But and then people would ask me, can you use DNA in your research? I said, and at that time I said, no, I can't, because I'm looking for an apple that we don't know exists, and so we don't know its DNA. Well, I've kind of changed my tune. Because, first of all, now if one of our apples is identified by our apple identification experts, let's say they say it's I'll say the Nero apple. Before we declare it's a recovered apple, then we send it in for DNA testing. And there was one, I can remember, we thought we had an apple, and it turned out to be an apple called the Man that was in the database already. And so we had to remove an apple from our list of recovered. They look, very close. But also the cool thing about DNA testing now is it can't tell you that an apple is a lost variety. It can only tell you that it's not in the database. But it can also tell you the parents of the apple, which is really cool, because I can think of, there's one apple tree just west of Pullman, about 5 miles west of Pullman, and a lady there showed me the apple trees right next to kind of a swampy area. The tree, I don't think 2 people could touch fingertips around this tree. I'm thinking that tree's got to be 150 years old, and
sent it in and the apple is good. I won't say, super or anything like that, but it's a good apple. And the DNA testing came back and its parents were Red Delicious and Gold Delicious. Well, Red Delicious was not introduced till 1895, and Gold Delicious was not introduced till 1915. So that's pretty close to 1920 is our cutoff, and so there's no way that it could be a lost variety. It just happened to be a seed, maybe a deer ate an apple and pooped up in that area, and an apple tree grew.
Okay, let's see. Fake, that was southern Idaho. Goldrich from near Pomeroy. Buttersweet of Pennsylvania. Okay, this is cool. Okay, this is from Genesee, and the fellow contacted me. His name is Dave Wall, and I went out to. Dave said that he has a homestead out there, and owns the property around the homestead, and that there are still apple trees from that era. So I went out there. One of them turned out to be Buttersweet of Pennsylvania. And every year I would go out there, and one of these years, Dave said to me, "So, do you know much about Cashup Davis?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I do. Yeah, I'm very familiar with him." He said, "Well, let me tell you a little story." So Dave's probably almost 90 years old, right around 90. He said when he was a young child, living with his folks, they had a boarder in their basement. And the boarder's his name was Shorty. And by that time, Shorty was kind of crippled up. He couldn't do much. But Shorty was fun, and he would tell Dave all sorts of stories about his life. And Shorty was only about this tall, too. So one of the jobs Shorty had was he worked for Cashup Davis. And he was the carriage driver that took the people up to the hotel. Anyway, it's weird how. And also another cool thing.
Excuse me?
Yeah.
My husband grew up with David Wall.
David Wall.
You did.
Next farm. Yes.
Oh, that is so cool. And Dave Wall is a cowboy poet.
Yes, he is. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a wonderful cowboy poet. Something I'm not going to get into. You have to, if you want to buy my book, you can learn about it. I'm not going to get into, but the Steptoe Hotel burned down in 1911. And everybody thought it was just kids. And I actually spoke to the relative of a person who burned down the Steptoe Hotel.
Oh, wow.
That's kind of a cool story. Okay, but you have to read it.
Why'd they do it?
I'm sorry. But the library's got the book too, so I'll show you that. Okay, the K apple. That was found just across the border in Oregon. If you go to Anatone and then keep going, there's a little town. You cross into Oregon. There's a little town called Flora, and a K was found pretty close to that. And in kind of a coincidence, this apple was sent to the USDA by somebody who lived in Lewiston. And I didn't mention also the Mialafi and a couple other recovered apples had been sent into the USDA to be painted by George Rudy. There's Almoda. That's a local apple from the Almoda area right down on the Snake River. And that won first prize at the county fair in the early 1890s. Okay, I already talked to you a little bit about the DNA and how we use that now. So we hope that from using our apple identification experts and using DNA, we'll be able to identify every apple every delicious apple that we run across. Well, there have been a couple apples that we've not been able to do this. We ran the two apples that I'm going to show you here in a second for like 3 years. And the DNA was unique, so it's not an apple was in the database at least. But they're delicious apples, and we wanted to preserve these apples. And so what we've done is given them a provisional name or a temporary name. This one happens to be Gamble Gold. This was found Dave Wall's, who was it? Dave Wall's grandfather.
Yeah, his name was Gus Gamble.
There you go, right there. And he lived up near Moscow. And so I got introduced to the property. I met the property owner. He said, yeah, get whatever you need. And there's these two Gamble Golds standing there side by side, and wonderful apple. Couldn't figure out what they were, but we've named them, and we make them available to the public now. Okay, Polybemus was another one. And I don't have many of you heard of Polybemus? Okay, quick history story. Polybemus was likely to have been abducted from China in the 1800s, brought as in her teen years, brought to Idaho, and eventually married a miner near Salmon, Idaho. And they had a homestead. Well, I won't call it a homestead. They bought property on the Salmon River. Today, it's only accessible. It's truly only accessible by boat or helicopter. You can go on a back road there, but I think you'd have to have a very strong stomach and a lot of time, because it would take a long time to get there. But anyway, at Polybemus's homestead, there was an apple orchard. There still is an apple orchard. You can tell there are rows where the apples used to be, and some of the apple trees are still there. Some of them are gone. There were two of what we now call Polybemus that are still growing there. Couldn't identify them, and so we've given it the provisional name of Polybemus. There's been 2 books written about her life, a movie about her life. She was very definitely an amazing person. Later, her husband was shot, and basically he was kind of handicapped from then on, and she took care of him, and she's very important to Idaho history. Okay, Haycock, that's a new one's going to be announced this year. Andrew Sweet is going to be announced this year too. Shh, don't tell anybody. Okay. I'm often asked, why did these apples become extinct? Well, it wasn't planned or anything like that, but the people that were using the many, many varieties, the reason that the Vinland nursery was selling 140 cultivars of apples was because of the advice that the Oakdale nursery was giving out, and that was good for homesteaders, which is, have a lot of apple trees. You never know if one's going to be biennial. You don't know if one's going to get frosted out. And that was when you're not, you don't have a steady supply. You can't go down to the grocery store and get food. You better be sure you've got a supply of apples to hold you over for the winter. And, but that became less and less important. People would come out and homestead, and at first they were just using maybe a scythe to bring in their wheat. That later came up to horse-drawn, I'll call it a combine. But then as we start getting in the early 1900s, they started making steam-powered engines. Well, a combine today costs, you can pay $1 million for a combine today. Well, if you own, and homesteads were 160 acres. If you own 160 acres today, you can't buy a $1 million combine and expect to pay for it with your wheat crop. So that was the same thing that was going on in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The equipment was becoming more efficient, but it was becoming more expensive. So you either got big as a farmer, or say go home. Become something else, sell your property, become a storekeeper or something like that. Well, this was printed in 1918. It's a little magazine in the Northwest for nurseries. And they said, basically, unprofitable varieties of fruit. And these were the apples. And they said, basically, don't sell these anymore, because people don't know if if somebody a farmer has purchased like 5 tracts of apples, or excuse me, 5 tracts of homesteads, he's not in it for the apples. He doesn't know what apples are out there. And if somebody eventually comes out and maybe moves into one of those houses, they don't know what the apple trees are. And here's the list. They said these are unprofitable, and right on the list are apples like Langford. Where was the Langford? Well, they had Langfield, but that's probably Langford. I think the Arkansas Beauty. That was one we found. Babbitt, we still haven't found that. Let's see. Early Colton, that was lost for a while. Fall Geniting is one we found. So a lot of these apples have become lost. A lot of them haven't too. There are nurseries around the country that kind of specialize in old apple varieties, and they still have many of them. But we're trying to bring back as many as we can. And here's just a little picture of our Lost Apple project. What we do is we sell grafting wood in the spring. We put a post on our Facebook page. Our Facebook page is Lost Apple Project. And usually on January 1st, we announce what grafting wood is available. And also people who live in the region can come pick up trees, and they can order trees from us. We don't ship, but you can come into Eastern Washington and pick up trees. Questions?